and households of everybody and every business.
There could be a number of impacts if the conflict goes on for weeks or months. As the oil price rises, there's likely to be a fairly quick impact on the price of petrol and diesel. Rising production costs could have broader consequences. For example, if fertiliser prices go up, so too could the price of food. Then there's interest rates. Economic shocks because of the war might mean that interest rates come down more slowly, meaning higher borrowing costs for homeowners. Gas prices are increasing too, which could have an impact on household bills, although the Prime Minister said many households will be protected for now by the energy price cap.
I would just say on energy prices for households, the energy price cap is in place until June, and therefore we're not anticipating that is going to change, which will give a degree of reassurance.
The Chancellor met with her G7 counterparts this afternoon, ministers from other major economies all wrestling with new cost of living challenges. The government says it understands concerns over the cost of living and is working with other countries to mitigate the impact. In the past, like at the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the government did intervene to help with rising costs, but that is extremely expensive. And ministers are hoping at the moment that this is a short-term economic impact. The longer, though, that this war goes on, the more prices are impacted, the more calls for financial assistance will increase.
Just last week, Rachel Reeves had an opportunity to cut fuel duty, and she didn't do so. Instead, she's going to be lifting it in September. That's one of the biggest things that they could be doing.
This was the message from President Trump over the weekend. Oil prices will drop rapidly when the Iran nuclear threat is over, a very small price to pay for USA and world safety and peace. The president might be characteristically confident. Other world leaders and millions of households here will be hoping he's right. Nick Early, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's bring you more now on Iran's new supreme leader. Mojtaba Khamenei is the son of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the first wave of US-Israeli strikes. Over the years, he's kept a low profile, but leaked US diplomatic cables once described him as the power behind the robes. When he was 17, he served in the military during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, fighting against the US-backed Iraqi forces. Many analysts expect him to continue his father's hardline policies. Mojtaba hasn't escaped controversy, though. He was twice accused of politically interfering to help the election victory of former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a populist hardliner. BBC Persian has been gathering messages from Iranians inside the country. These are from last night and today, after the announcement of Mojtaba as Iran's new supreme leader. And they were sent via text message and have been voiced up by our colleagues.
Even the slimmest chance for a change no longer exists within the system. The Assembly could not have selected anyone closer to the former leader, so everything will remain much the same. They don't even need to change their chance to support the name.
Why isn't there much information available about him so we can see how charismatic he actually is? They sent out mass texts saying he has become the leader. Now I'm just waiting for Trump's speech.
This means that nothing is going to change. It's the same path, perhaps even worse. Anyhow, I don't think the situation can continue. I don't think that it will last.
Let's hear now from Parang Tajdeen from BBC Persian, who has been commenting on claims that Mojtaba Khamenei was injured in the strike that killed his father.
That's correct, because the strike last Saturday killed his father, his mother, and his wife, and other members of the family, but we haven't heard anything about him. So we don't know whether Mojtaba Khamenei at the time was in the same, Supreme Leader residence or not. So there are speculation rife, and it's better not to go far. All we know so far is there hasn't been any reports about his whereabouts or his state of health. The only thing that we know is somehow the Assembly of Experts last night kind of had a meeting in the city of Qom, and they made the decision to name him as the next supreme leader of Iran.
And was it them or the heavy influence of the Revolutionary Guards who have such a close relationship with him that sort of made that final decision?
That's a very good question. But again, the problem is that when 37 years earlier, the previous Assembly of Experts chose his father, Ali Khamenei, as the new supreme leader after Ayatollah Khomeini, that session was televised. This time it wasn't. So we don't know what happened there. But let's not make a conclusion that this is the Revolutionary Guard's cause decision, because the majority of the members of the Assembly of Experts are people who are as hardline as the IRGC and as the previous supreme leader. So it's not surprising for them to make this decision and this choice.
We spoke yesterday about how things are for people living in Iran at the moment. The attacks on the oil depots, the toxic smoke, the fumes in the atmosphere, the acid rain, and the fear. Have you learned anything more from some of the contacts that you've had inside Iran about what's happening there today and how people are feeling?
First of all, this is the 10th day that most people in Iran have no access to internet, cannot call even abroad, and they get these messages, these text messages kind of threatening them not to say anything against the regime's lines or take any actions against that. We even heard today that people are getting messages saying that if you take any action or say anything against the regime, your assets may be confiscated. So that's going on. The checkpoints that not just in Tehran, in every city, Basij militia, the state-aligned militia have set up. They are still going on, which means that people, cannot even travel inside the cities, easily. And at the same time, we are hearing that many of the targets, not just in Tehran or Isfahan or other big cities, even in smaller cities, the places that are being targeted are at least close to residential areas and residential buildings, and that's why we have seen at least 1,200 casualties, which it seems like most of them are civilians and not armed forces.
Let's update you on what is happening in the UAE, because they have detected, they say, 15 missiles and 18 drones today. Since the start of Iran's attacks, the ministry says it has detected a total of 253 ballistic missiles, 8 cruise missiles, and 1,440 drones. The attacks resulting in 4 deaths and 117 injuries so far. Let's give you a sense of how it feels in Dubai right now. We can take you to our correspondent, Nick Beek. Nick, what are the Defence Ministry there saying about their response to what is happening in the skies at the moment?
Hi, Lucy. Well, they say once again they've been in action trying to intercept the latest Iranian missile and drone barrage that's been sent across the water, across the Gulf to here. Life pretty much goes on for the main part. Most of the time, you can see the skyscrapers behind us, the distinctive skyline here. Construction continues, but periodically there are these threats, alerts sent to mobile phones. Saturday night, an illustration of the danger this city still faces when a Pakistani man was killed after falling debris from an interception struck his car, and he was killed. And as you said, once again, more missiles and drones have been sent, and that's a picture that's reflected across the Gulf states. They're trying to work out what to do, Lucy, because so far they've been really absorbing this, and they haven't been fighting back. And so there's a calibration there in terms of whether they up the ante or hope that Iran, their neighbour, will really dampen things down and stop lashing out at them.
And Dubai, of course, an international business centre, Nick. What's been the reaction from the financial world and from business leaders there to what's going on?
Well, really interesting this, because if you look at the position the UAE are in at the moment. They are an ally of the US. They've moved towards Israel in terms of normalizing relations more than many other countries near here. But now they find themselves in a war that they didn't start. They've been dragged into this. And so there are discussions, no doubt, behind the scenes about what they do. Clearly, this is a place which has built up a reputation as being business friendly. So many expats live here, the vast majority of the population. This sort of image of Dubai as a place which is tax friendly, the weather's good, and that business can be done here. They will be concerned in the mid to long term if there are impacts on this reputation. And I mean, we were just out at the coast earlier on today, near the port, and we could, so it's a huge operation there, the busiest port in the Middle East. And on the day that we hear that these oil prices have shot up so much, real concerns about the ramification for global trade, for supply routes, and what may happen in the weeks to come if this doesn't stop anytime soon. And of course, at the moment, there's no sign of that, Lucy.
And then just speaking to people, obviously there will be different opinions, but do most people feel secure at the moment, or is there a sense of fear?
I don't think there's a sense of panic. I think there are daily reminders of the threat that's faced. A lot of people here continue to work. I mean, it's quite striking that the people who've been killed across the Gulf in the past week that this war has been going on have been foreign workers. And I mean, if you look when the alerts come in, quite often construction workers and other people from other countries keep on doing their work. I don't know whether they have an option to go and take shelter or whether it's a decision they make, but that is quite striking. And so, yes, I think some people will be worried, particularly by what we saw on Saturday, Lucy. This drone strike at the airport, and this footage went viral, it could have been catastrophic if this drone, Iranian drone, it would seem, had come down anywhere in a slightly different position, because it landed, it looked like, very, very near to one of the terminal buildings. You could see planes on the tarmac, so things could have been very different there. Interestingly, the authorities after that, they shut the airport and then reopened it pretty quickly afterwards, but there was no public acknowledgement of what had happened here. And all the while, the message is that we're doing all we can to support you, to look after you, and to protect you. But there are daily reminders, and right at the start, when you talk about the number of missiles and drones that are still being fired, the danger is real.
Nick, thanks so much. Nick Beek joining us there from Dubai. More to come. Stay with us around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News.
Ambassador, you say Iran was racing towards a nuclear capability, and President Trump has argued both that there was an imminent threat and that Iran could have a nuclear weapon within weeks. But neither he nor Israel has shared any evidence to back that up. Do you intend to share evidence at some point?
But what evidence you need? You know. First of all, they declared what their intentions are regarding the nuclear program. They enrich uranium above 60%. They put all the facilities in the mountains. So we didn't want to wait for the point of no return that they will actually assemble the nuclear warheads on the ballistic missiles. That would have been too late for us. So I think President Trump acted, showed leadership, showed moral clarity. And basically what we are saying, we will not make the mistake that the Western civilization did with North Korea. That, there were negotiations, delays, talks, and then one morning, we woke up, and North Korea has a nuclear power and ballistic missiles that can threaten many countries.
Could carry out strikes against Iran after Sir Keir Starmer granted permission to use the base. Let's take you to Duncan Kennedy, who is there for us at RAF Fairford. A lot of activity there today. Duncan, despite the weather, what's been happening?
A lot of activity, Lucy, especially over the last 72 hours or so. Some of the real heavy-duty American firepower, if you can put it like that. So this morning we've seen 3 B-52s land, for example. They've come in from somewhere. We don't know where they've come in from. These are the old Warhorse aircraft that date back to the mid-1950s. seen service everywhere from Vietnam to Afghanistan. They're subsonic, they're not particularly fast, but they can travel vast distances and deliver a huge payload of munitions. They've come to Fairford because it's got a gigantic runway, something like 10,000 feet long. We've also seen over the weekend 4 B-1 bombers land. These are much more modern aircraft, they're slightly stealthy, they too can travel thousands of miles without the need for being refueled, and they can also carry huge payloads of weapons, most notably for the B-1s, up to 24 cruise missiles. We don't know what all these movements mean, Lucy, but lots of it, and a demonstration of the size of the American firepower that they can bring to bear when these kinds of conflicts arise.
And the politics of this, Duncan, the fact that they're only there because the Prime Minister gave permission for them to land.
That's right. You remember this row between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer about access to places like this and to the one in the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia. Last Sunday, not yesterday, last Sunday, the British Prime Minister said, yes, the Americans can use these UK bases, only, though, for defensive missions. And what that probably means is, if these take off, they'll go to Iran, not to attack it generally, but to take out things like ballistic missile bases or drone launchers, so that those missile bases and those drones can't be used to attack UK and other allied bases in the region. So that's what it most likely means, that they'll be in a defensive posture. What we don't know, though, Lucy, is that a week, 2, 3, 4 weeks down the line, could the Americans come back and say to Mr. Starmer, look, you know, we need to up this game, we need to go on offensive missions and change the use of these bases. If they did that, there will be an almighty row between the UK and the US over that forced posture.
Duncan, thank you so much. France will send 2 additional warships to the region as part of a European Union naval mission in the Red Sea. The announcement was made by President Emmanuel Macron as he visited Cyprus, where a British military base was targeted by an Iranian-made drone last week. He said the EU was setting up a purely defensive escort mission. Speaking after meeting with the Cypriot president and the Greek prime minister, President Macron also said the attack on the military base in Cyprus is an attack on all of Europe. Our correspondent Jessica Parker is in Paphos, and she told me what the atmosphere is like amongst the locals there.
It really does depend who you ask. So, I mean, some people who live near the base, it's worth saying the British sovereign bases, they're not just the sort of fenced-off areas that people can't go into, although we did go into RAF Akrotiri briefly last week. They also include local villages, farmland, where Cypriots live, and some of those people were instructed to leave their homes, and schools have been closed following what happened on the base and following that drone strike. UK military intelligence's best assessment, I understand, is that the drone was launched in Lebanon, possibly by the Iranian-backed proxy group Hezbollah. So that's their sort of assessment of where that drone might have come from. But I think for Cypriots, it's shone a light again on a long-standing point of contention here about the presence of British bases, which are a legacy of colonialism. The Cyprus gained its independence back in 1960, but as a part of that independence, the UK retained 2 major sovereign bases, one of them Akrotiri, and for some people in Cyprus, I was at a protest over the weekend, 250, 300 people, so not lots of people, but very vocal, who were calling for the British bases to go, to not be here anymore. The reality is that's a pretty complicated thing to make happen. There were various parties involved in those original treaties that are sort of the foundation of their presence here, but it certainly has shone a light on what, as I say, is an ongoing point of contention and discomfort for some Cypriots, although others may talk about, are the British bases a way that the island is protected? But obviously now a drone actually got through, a small drone, we've been told, but got through and did hit that aircraft hangar. That has led to questions about the UK's ability to defend the area, although, as I say, the British government say they have bolstered air defences.
Jessica Parker there. Well, the BBC's Persian language service has been interviewing people who are on the Iran-Turkey border about how they've been affected by the conflict. And this includes Ramazan, who is a minibus driver who makes a living from transporting people between Iran and Turkey. Listen.
Normally at this time there are many passengers and we earn good money. Because of this war, right now we can't go from here to Iran. There's no internet there either, and passengers aren't travelling back and forth like before.
Our home is in Tehran, but honestly, haven't heard from almost anyone. We said we'll just get on the road and see if we could find the car and make it back, or at least try to reach somewhere. We were stuck in Sao Paulo for about 5 or 6 days because there were no flights. Now we're just trying to return.
I came to Turkey to see if there's any work here, maybe stay and work here. If not, maybe go somewhere else. But in Iran, it's really hard to make progress anymore. The economy is in a state where you can't move forward. You can't really build something or grow a business.
Just a sense of some of the attitudes there from our correspondents who are on the border. We have a breaking news line to bring you from President Trump, who has just said that Australia is making a terrible humanitarian mistake by allowing Iran's national women's football team to be sent back to Iran. And he called on Australia's Prime Minister to give asylum to the team members. More on this coming up. Don't go away.
Well, let's speak to Mehran Kamrava, who's Professor of Government at Georgetown University here in Qatar and Director of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Centre for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. Tell us a little more about what we know about this man. In many ways, a mystery, but a man clearly who has some power.
Exactly. He's a very unknown figure, but he's got tremendous power behind the scenes. He's someone who's been involved in the key decisions that have been made over the last several years. He's got connections throughout the Iranian political system, particularly among the Revolutionary Guards. He's rumored to have been the choice of the Revolutionary Guards. And he is someone who's familiar with the inner working of a political system that is highly complex and multi-layered. So we can expect continuity over the next several weeks, if not months.
And is this a choice of leader that would have been made outside of a time of war? Because some people are saying that that has influenced the decision made by the Assembly of Experts, the circumstances, particular circumstances that Iran finds itself in right now.
Exactly. I think under ordinary circumstances, Mojtaba Khamenei would not have stood a chance because his father expressly forbid his son from succeeding him. But now the father is gone and the system is fighting for its very survival. It's faced with an existential crisis, and almost more than anything else, it wants continuity in terms of operations and modus operandi. And for that purpose, it assumes that Mojtaba Khamenei is the man.
How many of those big decisions will he be taking now, and how many are following a pre-planned, preordained system for what Iran would do if it was attacked in this way?
It's very hard to tell. At least in the immediate term, he will be making similar decisions that his father made, continuing to resist and attack American targets whenever or wherever available. And I think for the foreseeable future, it'll be business as usual under war circumstances. If he gets a chance, if the system survives and doesn't collapse, we might actually see a fair amount of change in the coming months if the Islamic Republic survives, because Mojtaba is rumored to be very pragmatic and practical, and the system's survival now requires an abandonment of radicalism and ideological zeal and pragmatism.
This is BBC News, the headlines. The Iran war sparks a record oil price spike, a barrel of crude oil now more than $100. G7 finance ministers have met to discuss the global economic turmoil caused by the US-Israeli war against Iran. Japan's finance minister said they'd agreed to take steps to ease the crisis. Iran names the hardliner Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of the late supreme leader, as his successor. He has close ties with the Iran Revolutionary Guards. Israel continues to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon, including in southern Beirut, a stronghold of the militant group Hezbollah. In the last hour, the Lebanese health ministry said 2 medics have been killed. In the latest wave of strikes, almost 400 people have been killed. Hello, I'm Lucy Hockings. Good to have you with us. Let's just update you now on what we're hearing from President Trump, who is up, obviously, in Washington, D.C. and on Truth Social. This is the latest post that he has put up, and it concerns the Iranian women's football team who are in Australia at the moment. Just to give you the context, they're in Australia because they've been competing in the Asian Cup, and they have now been eliminated. And football's governing bodies and Australian authorities have been urged by many people to ensure the safety of the team, and many people calling for them to be given asylum. And now we have President Trump saying Australia is making a terrible humanitarian mistake by allowing the Iran national women's soccer team to be forced back to Iran, where they will most likely be killed. Don't do it, Mr. Prime Minister. Give asylum. The US will take them if you don't. And thank you for attention in this matter. So President Trump urging Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, to give the team asylum. We'll bring you more on this as we get it, but we do understand that some of the girls are being held in a safe house at the moment in Australia. There was controversy when after their first match, or before their first match, they didn't sing the national anthem. They did do so for their subsequent matches, but this real feeling that some of the women may now be in danger, and calls for Australia to show moral leadership from many people in Australia, but also now from President Trump. In the Middle East, both sides do continue to carry out strikes. Huge explosions have been heard in Tehran today, and the Israeli military says it's also targeting Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy group in Beirut. Gulf states, including Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, say they've intercepted attacks from Iran. It comes after Iran officially unveiled its new leader, who is the son of the former Ayatollah. Joe Inwood has the latest.
It was a show of defiance from supporters of the regime who came onto the streets, and from the clerical establishment of Iran, who chose a hardliner, Mujtaba Khamenei, to be their new supreme leader. If that name sounds somewhat familiar, it is because he is the son of the last supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, killed in the opening salvos of this war. Amongst the cheering crowds, his appointment was welcomed.
It was a profound happiness. We truly didn't know whether to mourn the loss of our leader or rejoice at the selection of the new leader.
But not everyone welcomed the news. Death to Mujtaba, she shouts. Another voice replies, distant, death to Mujtaba. Soon, reaction was coming into the BBC's Persian service.
They have killed his father and he won't let go. If he can't get revenge on the US, he will take his revenge on ordinary people. I hope that Israel and the United States will target him.
The assembly could not have chosen anyone closer to the former leader. So everything will remain much the same. They don't even need to change their chants.
It is not just opponents of the regime inside Iran that will not welcome his appointment. Israel has said they will kill whoever was selected, while Donald Trump previously said he wouldn't last.
The appointment of Mujtaba Khamenei is the reflection of the fact that the hardliners in that system now have the upper hand. Not only are they saying they're going to continue this fight, at least in the short term militarily, but they're also saying politically they have a game plan.
For now, that plan seems to be to continue to launch attacks against the US's Gulf allies. Bahrain was hit with more drone strikes overnight.
Target destroyed.
This footage was released by the UAE, showing their pilots shooting down Iranian drones. But there are reports their air defense missiles are running low. Israel, which along with the US launched this war, has not been spared its consequences. This was the result of a missile being shot down in the center of the country. But the death toll is far higher in Lebanon, where Israel has been continuing its attacks against the militant group Hezbollah after they fired missiles and drones in support of Iran. The question the more than 500,000 people who have now been told to leave their homes will be asking, when might this all end? The US Secretary of Defense said this to American TV.
It means we're fighting to win. It means we set the terms. We'll know when they're not capable of fighting. There'll be a point where they'll have no choice but to do that. Whether they know it or not, they will be combat ineffective. They will surrender.
The weekend saw devastating attacks on Iran's oil industry, shrouding Tehran in a veil of thick, acrid smoke, which still lingers over the city. The night may have seen the election of a new supreme leader, but with no indication this war will end anytime soon, few will think of this as a new dawn. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
Well, as we mentioned, G7 nations have been meeting to discuss surging oil prices as crude jumped above $100 a barrel and stock markets slumped over the escalating war. Finance ministers from leading industrialised countries, including the UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves, are discussing the economic impact of the conflict. Global oil prices reaching nearly $120 on Monday over fears of a prolonged disruption to energy supplies through the key Strait of Hormuz shipping route, a surge not seen since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The UK's FTSE 100 share index also fell 1.5%. Our economics correspondent Theo Leggett explained why vital energy prices are rising.
Since the conflict in the Middle East started, the Straits of Hormuz have effectively been closed to shipping. That means oil tankers can't get in, but they can't get out either. So production facilities in the region, to start with, they've been producing oil, but they've had nowhere to put it. And there is a pipeline across Saudi Arabia, but a lot of that oil has simply been diverted onto empty tankers. Those tankers are now full, they can't leave anywhere, so some of these facilities are having to cut their production. Liquefied natural gas, one of the main global refineries for producing it, is in the Gulf. Ships can't get out, that's pushing up gas prices. So what we've seen is this very steep spike in oil prices, as you say, up to $119 a barrel in Asian trading. It's since come down to about $100 a barrel, but that is still $30 a barrel higher than it was a couple of weeks ago. And gas prices on wholesale markets in Europe, they've pretty much doubled. So you see, we have a very significant impact on the prices of very vital energy products.
And Theo, I just saw the IMF chief saying to her policy makers and people around the world, prepare for the unthinkable now, because one of the big concerns is that it's inflation that is going to be next.
Yes, although possibly not as high inflation as we saw, for example, in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what happens is so many goods require energy to be produced. So crude oil factors through into production costs of a huge range of products. Gas is used for heating, it's used for industrial production, and it's also used for electricity generation. So if you have a simultaneous rise in the cost of crude oil, also in the cost of natural gas, that is going to feed through into a swathe of things that we produce, that we use. Transport costs will rocket up as well. And so that factors into an increase in inflation. We don't know how much yet, because a lot depends on how high the oil price goes, how high the gas price goes, but also how long it stays high for. Because if prices came down sharply, the effects could be mitigated.
If this does continue, though, Theo, and we'll be taking our viewers live to Pakistan shortly too, to look at the impacts there and what's happening with prices. But if all of this continues, which areas of the global economy are most vulnerable?
Well, obviously, heavy manufacturing needs a lot of energy. So manufacturing costs will go up. That increases consumer prices for goods. Transport costs for consumer goods will go up as well. So you see all of these things going up, plus the cost to ordinary people of getting around, because motor fuel costs will go up as well. And if you live in an area where you require a lot of heating, gas prices going up, that won't help. So large proportions of the world, consumers, ordinary people, are going to feel the effects of this.
Well, governments are scrambling to limit the impact from the widening Iran war. Let's take a look at some of the measures that are being taken in Asia to preserve fuel and energy. Bangladesh has closed all universities and brought forward holidays for the Muslim festival of Eid. The Philippines has imposed a 4-day government work week after long queues formed outside petrol stations. Vietnam has removed import tariffs on fuels. Myanmar has restricted the use of private vehicles, and reports say that Japan is considering drawing on its national oil reserves to protect itself against possible prolonged supply disruptions. Our Pakistan correspondent Caroline Davies spoke to me from Islamabad about how the energy crisis will be particularly acute in that country.
Pakistan is hugely dependent on imported oil and gas, a large amount of it coming through the Strait of Hormuz, particularly oil from Saudi Arabia and gas from Qatar. Now, we have seen that the Pakistan government has increased the price of petrol and diesel here by around 20%. That is because of this dependency. But they have also said that they do have enough petrol reserves, but this is about trying to stretch those reserves. As you've heard from other countries talking about what measures they might put in place, there's been discussion here in Pakistan about what other measures could also be used, whether we might also see a limited number of days of government ministries being open and people being encouraged to work from home instead, schools in impact and universities as well, and potentially official meetings being held online rather than being held in person, all to try to preserve fuel. Now, Pakistan has a very large import bill for oil. We've heard from the finance minister that given the price of oil, that could go up to around $600 million every single month. So that is obviously a major concern for Pakistan. And as we've also seen, of course, when the price of fuel goes up, it doesn't just have an impact here at the pump, but that's likely to feed into food prices, into business, into industry. And in fact, anecdotally, we've already heard from some local media saying that they've already seen some food prices increase too. So a major concern about how wide this impact could be felt here in Pakistan.
And there you are, Carrie, standing in the forecourt of a petrol station. Is there panic buying taking place as well? Are people worried?
I'm so sorry. Could you say that again, Lucy?
No, just
Your
where you
line
are.
broke up.
Yeah, just where you are, Carrie. Are you seeing panic buying?
No, so part of the reason the government said that they were implementing this policy, they introduced it on Friday, this increase, was to stop hoarding of petrol and gas because they were concerned that people would start to do that. Now, gas prices increase in Pakistan by the governments decide those prices every 2 weeks, and so there was a concern that the next time that price was going to go up, that people would that it would go up, so people were trying to buy ahead of that price increase. So that's why this price increase was brought forward. So at the moment, we haven't seen large numbers of people queuing up since this price has been increased. But of course, we've also heard from the government reassurances that if the price of oil starts to drop down, that then they would see the prices here also decrease. But the worry, of course, is how long does the crisis in the Middle East continue for? So how long could this impact be felt here at the petrol pump and across the country?
I've also been speaking to Homayun Falik-Shahi, who is the head of crude oil analysis at the commodity intelligence platform Kepler, and I asked him how worried he was.
I would say that, the market has finally, become really worried about the situation, rightfully so. That's mainly due to the Strait of Hormuz, in effect, being more or less closed for a week. I would say, though, that some of this is already, some of the huge disruptions are already starting to be priced in. It's fair to assume, and I think this is what the market is currently pricing in now, is that we're going to see disruptions continue until the end of March. At the same time, you have other measures that can be taken by consuming countries, and namely the G7 reportedly is in talks to release 400 million barrels of oil, which would be equivalent to almost 3 months of consumption for these countries. So I would say that there are means to mitigate the risks around what's happening right now. But obviously, at the end of the day, the key question is how long is this going to last? And if it does last longer than a few weeks, then we probably should see prices continue to rise a lot higher compared to where they are now. So I think that there is a strong case to be worried.
And in terms of the Straits of Hormuz and what is happening there, are there any alternative routes that Gulf producers can realistically use while the straits remain closed like this?
Actually, yes, you do have two pipelines, one in Saudi Arabia, one in the UAE, that bypass the Strait of Hormuz, even though they are not sufficient to fully bypass the strait. So, for instance, Saudi Arabia used to export a bit more than 6 million barrels per day on its east coast, and we think it would be able to export 5 million barrels per day on the west coast. So that's a loss of 1 million barrels per day. Likewise, with the UAE, it would be roughly losing about 1 million barrels per day. But then the other countries like Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, they do not have any bypass options. So in effect, they've already reduced their production to a bare minimum because their storage capacity otherwise would have gotten very full very fast. Iran itself also has continued to load, and obviously Iran is less a threat because of what's happening. So its tankers have continued to load, and it's fair to assume that they will continue to reach markets.
Stay with us around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News.
Well, let's speak to Mehran Kamrava, who's Professor of Government at Georgetown University here in Qatar and Director of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. Tell us a little more about what we know about this. Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us here on BBC News. Tell us a little more about what we know about this man. In many ways, a mystery, but a man clearly who has some power.
Exactly. He's a very unknown figure, but he's got tremendous power behind the scenes. He's someone who's been involved in the decisions that have been made over the last several years. He's got connections throughout the Iranian political system, particularly among the Revolutionary Guards. He's rumored to have been the choice of the Revolutionary Guards. And he is someone who's familiar with the inner working of a political system that is highly complex and multi-layered. So we can expect continuity over the next several weeks, if not months.
And is this a choice of leader that would have been made?
More details on that at the moment, but in general it's been saying that it is deepening the damage to what it calls Iran's regime. Now this morning saw the first deadly Israeli airstrike in just over a week launched by Iran on Israel. That was in the center of the country with one foreign worker killed at a construction site, another there seriously wounded, and one other person seriously wounded as well. And Israeli police told journalists that there had been in one strike about half a dozen sites that were hit. This was another use of cluster munitions by Iran, these warheads that can break up into smaller bombs that disperse over a wider area, and they're much harder for air defenses to intercept, therefore. In Lebanon this lunchtime, what we have been hearing is that Israel is again carrying out heavy bombing of the southern suburbs of Beirut in Dahia, an area where they have told people once again that they should leave for their own safety. This is seen as being a Hezbollah stronghold in the south of the Lebanese capital. Of course, Israel has been facing missile and drone attacks across its northern border. And there's some more signs too, Lucy, that this could be, a long war, that preparations are being made for that, with the Israeli Ministry of Defense highlighting how since its strikes began on Iran, it says it has received 50 cargo planes carrying about 1,000 tons worth of weaponry and other military equipment. And Israeli media have been reporting too that two key envoys of President Trump, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, have cancelled what's reported being their plan to come and visit Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tomorrow.
That was Yolan Nell in Jerusalem. Let's just take you live to central London, to outside Westminster Abbey, where preparations are underway for an event there to mark Commonwealth Day. They have this service every year, and it will be the King and Queen, King Charles and Queen Camilla, who will lead the royal family at that service that is about to get underway. We haven't yet seen them arrive. Let's give you a sense of how it feels in Dubai right now. We can take you to our correspondent, Nick Beek. Nick, what are the Defence Ministry there saying about their response to what is happening in the skies at the moment?
Hi, Lucy. Well, they say once again they've been in action trying to intercept the latest Iranian missile and drone barrage that's been sent across the water, across the Gulf to here. Life pretty much goes on for the main part. Most of the time, you can see the skyscrapers behind us, the distinctive skyline here. Construction continues, but periodically there are these threats, alerts sent to mobile phones. Saturday night, an illustration of the danger this city still faces when a Pakistani man was killed after falling debris from an interception struck his car, and he was killed. And as you said, once again, more missiles and drones have been sent, and that's a picture that's reflected across the Gulf states. They're trying to work out what to do, Lucy, because so far they've been really absorbing this, and they haven't been fighting back. And so there's a calibration there in terms of whether they up the ante or hope that Iran, their neighbour, will really dampen things down and stop lashing out at them.
And Dubai, of course, an international business centre, Nick. What's been the reaction from the financial world and from business leaders there to what's going on?
Well, really interesting this, because if you look at the position the UAE are in at the moment, they are an ally of the US. They've moved towards Israel in terms of normalizing relations more than many other countries near here. But now they find themselves in a war that they didn't start. They've been dragged into this. And so there are discussions, no doubt, behind the scenes about what they do. Clearly, this is a place which has built up a reputation as being business friendly. So many expats live here, the vast majority of the population. This sort of image of Dubai as a place which is tax friendly, the weather's good, and the business can be done here. They will be concerned in the mid to long term if there are impacts on this reputation. And I mean, we were just out at the coast earlier on today, near the port, and we could, so it's a huge operation there, the busiest port in the Middle East. And on the day that we hear that these oil prices have shot up so much, real concerns about the ramification for global trade, for supply routes, and what may happen in the weeks to come if this doesn't stop anytime soon. And of course, at the moment, there's no sign of that, Lucy.
And Nick, just speaking to people, obviously there will be different opinions, but do most people feel secure at the moment, or is there a sense of fear?
I don't think there's a sense of panic. I think there are daily reminders of the threat that's faced. A lot of people here continue to work. I mean, it's quite striking that the people who've been killed across the Gulf in the past week that this war has been going on have been foreign workers. And I mean, if you look when the alerts come in, quite often construction workers and other people from other countries keep on doing their work. I don't know whether they have an option to go and take shelter or whether it's a decision they make, but that is quite striking. And so, yes, I think some people will be worried, particularly by what we saw on Saturday, Lucy, this drone strike at the airport, and this footage went viral, it could have been catastrophic if this drone, Iranian drone, it would seem, had come down anywhere in a slightly different position, because it landed, it looked like, very, very near to one of the terminal buildings. You could see planes on the tarmac, so things could have been very different there. Interestingly, the authorities after that, they shut the airport and then reopened it pretty quickly afterwards, but there was no public acknowledgement of what had happened here. And all the while, the message is that we're doing all we can to support you, to look after you, and to protect you. But there are daily reminders, and right at the start, when you talk about the number of missiles and drones that are still being fired, the danger is real.
Let's return now to central London, to West.
So let's assess what we know with Chris Wheaton. He's Managing Director and Energy Analyst at Stifel Investment Bank. Chris, good to have you with us. And perhaps no surprise, we see that effective shutdown of that crucial waterway, not only to transport the oil, but to let other things back in. And prices are rising as a result.
Yes, good morning, Ben. You're absolutely right. The 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas as well. And that's why we've seen the massive spike in prices, now up 50% or more since close of business a week Friday. And the longer the strait stays closed, the worse this problem is going to get. And that's why we've seen the G7 finance ministers meeting today to discuss that emergency release of oil you just mentioned.
Yes, so talk to me about what powers they have at their disposal. What are they potentially able to do?
The actual release, I think, is going to be pretty minimal in terms of actually keeping a lid on prices for the moment, because the market isn't concerned about where oil is today. It's concerned about where the oil is going to be coming from in 1, 2, 3 months' time. The key thing Western ministers can do is push to get the Strait of Hormuz open as soon as possible, because it's not just oil and gas that flow through the Strait of Hormuz. It's a vital conduit for many elements of global trade. So, for example, a third of the world's nitrogen fertilizer flows through the Strait of Hormuz as it's manufactured in the Persian Gulf. That's going to have an impact on food prices. 10% of the world's aluminium comes out of the out of the Persian Gulf. 30% of the world's helium comes to the Persian Gulf. So there's ramifications well beyond just energy for the global economy, and we're going to see the inflation effects, and they already are starting to be priced in by investment markets, and we're already seeing government interest rates rise with the rising perceived risk of inflation.
Yeah, it really is astonishing when you run through a list like that of just how dependent the world economy is on what is produced in that region. Chris, I'm looking at reports as well on Bloomberg this morning suggesting Saudi Arabia may start cutting production. And that sounds perverse, but they may do so because they've nowhere to store it. This moves it into another realm, doesn't it? Because as soon as you start reducing production, it's very hard to turn it back on again. It's not just a tap, is it?
It isn't just a tap. The key thing is going to be, as we've just talked about, actually making sure there's that flow of tankers in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, that empty tankers can then be refilled and then go to their end customers elsewhere, particularly in Asia. And that's where we've seen the panic buying, I think, really start in the last week, because Asia's been reliant on about 80% of its oil demands from the Persian Gulf. The key thing is going to be yes, you're absolutely right. The storage facilities are full. The empty tankers floating in the Strait of Hormuz are now also full, which means there's nowhere else to put the oil, which means you've got to turn off the taps. Ultimately, if you turn those off, then there's going to be a period of time before you can turn them back on again. And the key thing for the global economy now is making sure that period of time is as short as possible. The oil can flow, and if the shorter the shutdown, the much easier it is to turn the taps back on. It's like leaving your car on the drive after a holiday. The longer you leave it, the harder it is going to start it up at when you come back to it after your time away. Yeah, and that's what the world economy is facing.
airstrikes here in the Middle East. The price of oil tipped over $100 a barrel at one stage today, an increase of almost 50% since the war began. Iran has named the hardliner Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Supreme Leader, as his successor. We'll analyse what we know about the new leader.
At BBC Verify, we've been investigating new footage which experts say shows a US missile hitting a military base next to an Iranian school.
Israel continues to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon, including in southern Beirut. Over 400 people have been killed in the country in the last week. Also this hour, we have a panel of experts to answer your questions about the war as the economic impacts really begin to bite. Hello, you're live with BBC News. I'm Anna Foster here in the Qatari capital, Doha. It is day 10 of the conflict here in the Middle East, and its effects are being felt right around the world. Oil prices have soared amid growing fears of an energy supply crisis. That is likely to push up the cost of petrol and jet fuel, which could hike the price of air travel. Crude oil rose above $100 a barrel for a time as the Strait of Hormuz shipping channel remains effectively closed. Iranian fuel depots are also being hit hard by US and Israeli airstrikes. Well, a discussion by G7 finance ministers on mitigating the economic turmoil caused by Donald Trump's war on Iran has ended without a decision on the release of oil reserves. Some countries in Asia have been hit particularly hard, and they have announced measures to limit the impact on their economies. Any immediate hope of tensions easing has been dashed by the naming of Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of Iran's late supreme leader, as his successor. Meanwhile, Iran has launched a fresh wave of missile and drone strikes targeting Israel and the Gulf states. And in the last few hours, NATO member Turkey says it is deploying 6 of its F-16 warplanes to northern Cyprus. Well, Iran's security chief says the selection of Mojtaba Khamenei as its new supreme leader has left the United States and Israel, in his words, in despair. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has congratulated Khamenei, saying he wished to confer his unwavering support and solidarity. Well, I'm joined by my colleague from BBC Persian, Siavash Ardalan. BBC Persian is the Persian language service of BBC News. It's used by 24 million people around the world, many of them inside Iran, other services often blocked. Siavash, there is much discussion about this choice of the late Supreme Leader's son to succeed him. What does that tell us about the country and about the choices being made right now?
Well, there was a lot of politics, obviously, going into the discussions that the Assembly of Experts had in choosing him. Some were worried that Mojtaba Khamenei has never held a public office. Thereby, he may not be competent enough to run the country under wartime conditions and perhaps beyond. But others are saying because of his very close ties to Iran's Revolutionary Guard and to the security establishment, he is well positioned to not just command the IRGC's respect, but if he decides to take the country in another direction, or if there are any talks of a ceasefire, he will be the person to be able to do that, given that his father, his son, his wife, and his children have been killed in the Israeli attack. So he cannot by any means be accused within the establishment of taking a soft line. Now we're awaiting an address, his first address to the nation that could happen at any time today, and we'll be watching it very closely to look for cues as to whether he is a hardliner, more hardliner than his father, as hardliner as his father, or maybe he would take a more moderate stance, because all these things have been speculated in the past over the years, that there was always talk of the possibility that he may succeed his father. So whether he will become Iran's next Kim Jong-un or Mohammed bin Salman, it remains to be seen.
And what about people living in Iran, Siavash? Because unlike some other countries around the world where a change of leader might make a difference to people, obviously the situation in Iran, the strength of the regime, it's slightly different. So how will this impact people's day-to-day lives there?
Well, right now the situation is very different because we're under wartime conditions, but how that's sat with people inside Iran, it really depends on which class of society you belong to. If we're talking about those minority of hardcore regime loyalists, they have been very reinvigorated, and it has been a morale boost for them. Last night, upon a news announcement that he has succeeded the supreme leader, there were scenes of jubilation and celebration under bombardment in different cities by the supporters of the regime, while at the same time, dissidents and opponents of the regime were chanting slogans against him on their rooftops. So for the majority of Iranians who have seen that crackdown, that terrible, deadly crackdown that took place in January, and who are very bitter about it, this was really a slap in the face, because they are considering him to be really a continuation of the same person who ordered that kind of crackdown. But for his supporters, it was an act of defiance against President Trump, who had before said that he finds Mojtaba Khamenei unacceptable, but after the announcement of his succession, President Trump refused to answer questions in response to how he feels about it now.
Yeah, but one thing we do know is that whoever leads Iran at the moment is a target.
Absolutely. That's one thing that raises a question whether the Assembly of Experts has a plan B or plan C in case Mojtaba Khamenei gets hit. Now, he has had all the chances of trying to hide himself from the Israelis' very powerful intelligence gathering capabilities inside Iran. If Israelis manage to pull this off and manage to kill him, that would be a huge accomplishment for the Israelis and a humiliation for the Iranian regime. But if not, then it would be something to look for in terms of how this will play out during the course of the war, whether he would continue with this line that the government, that the regime in Iran has, that until the U.S. does not, announce defeat, and until the cost of this war has not risen to the point where the U.S. and Israelis feel that they made a mistake in carrying out this attack, that the war will continue and any proposal about a ceasefire will be dismissed.
Siavash, thank you. Siavash Adlan there from BBC Persian. Well, the BBC has verified a video which shows an American missile striking a military base next to a school in Iran at the start of the conflict. It's a claim that President Trump had previously denied, saying, based on what he'd seen, that Iran was responsible. The Iranian authorities say 168 people were killed in the school. BBC verifies Merlin Thomas has more.
One of the deadliest strikes in Iran was on this primary school in the southern city of Minab on the 28th of February, the first day of the war. Now, a new video has emerged, which gives us a much clearer insight into what happened. We verified this video published by the semi-official Iranian news agency, Mehr. It shows a missile striking an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps base next to the school. We've slowed the video down and zoomed in. Multiple weapons experts have told BBC Verify that this is a US Tomahawk missile. And it's worth saying Israel and Iran do not have Tomahawk missiles. As the camera pans to the right, you can see these large smoke plumes. They're rising above the area near the school, indicating it had been hit shortly before the Tomahawk struck the IRGC base. The missile hit the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps base near the Shajareh Taibeh primary school. Neither the US nor Israel have accepted or denied responsibility for the attack. But the new video casts serious doubt on the claim by US President Donald Trump on Saturday that Iran was responsible for the strike on the school. President Trump said, "In my opinion, and based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran. They're very inaccurate, as you know, with their munitions." But expert analysis of video and satellite evidence suggests that the area came under a wave of US strikes. Experts say this, combined with the verified footage of the significantly damaged school building, makes the scenario of a single Iranian missile landing at the same time as these nearby targeted strikes highly improbable. Funerals were broadcast on Iranian state media last week. Aerial footage showed neatly lined rows of at least 100 marked or freshly dug graves. The incident was one of the deadliest strikes so far, which Iranian authorities say killed 168 people. At BBC Verify, we'll continue to investigate the strike as more evidence emerges.
Well, let's speak to our North American correspondent, Helena Humphrey. And Helena, we were hearing there about that school attack. It is something that not just President Trump, but several senior members of the US administration have been asked about. Just remind us what their response was.
That's right, Anna. Indeed, they have, since the reports of that school strike in Iran there in Manab province. The BBC State Department, Tom Bateman, has repeatedly put those questions to the State Department, to the Pentagon, asking what more was known about this, whether a US weapon was behind that. And on a number of occasions, we have had the response that there was not further information available, that there was an investigation, but a reminder from the administration saying that they do not target civilians. We then since had over the weekend President Trump saying that he thought that it appeared to be an Iranian weapon that was behind that school strike. But as we know, BBC Verify has continued to look into exactly the events, how they unfolded, with that report from Merlin Thomas. But up until now, with repeated claims from the administration that they didn't have further information about that school strike.
Helena, thank you. Helena Humphrey there, our correspondent in Washington, D.C. Let me take you to New York now, to the United Nations, and Israel's representative to the UN, Danny Danon, is speaking there. Let's listen to what he's saying.
It's not easy. Israelis are in and out of bomb shelters. Our neighbors in the region are under attack. But allowing this regime to threaten the region and continue its oppression is not an option. So we will continue to target the leadership of the regime and dismantle its nuclear ballistic missile capabilities. As the machinery weakens, you, Mardumei Iran, the people of Iran, will have the opportunity to shape your future with rights and justice for women. In the past 11 days, Iran has fired missiles and drones across the region, at Israel, at our neighbors, and at civilian targets. The regime has attacked more Arab countries in the past 11 days than Israel has in its entire existence. This is not defense. This is aggression aimed at destabilizing our region. That is why we welcome the statement you issued by the Gulf Cooperation Council condemning the Iranian regime's attacks on civilian targets and its violation of international law. The Gulf countries also called on the Security Council to clearly condemn these attacks and demand that Iran stop immediately. We agree. The Security Council must act. It must make clear that these attacks are unacceptable and that Iran must stop and surrender. Let me be clear. Changing the man at the top does not change the regime. It is the same ideology, the same nuclear ambitions, the same ballistic missiles, the same terror proxies. For us, nothing changed. My advice to Tehran's new leadership: look at what happened to those who thought they could threaten the US and Israel. Israel remains committed to the objectives of this joint operation: to dismantle the regime's nuclear ballistic missile capabilities and weaken the machinery that allow it to threaten the region and oppress its own people. We hope that soon the people of Iran will have the opportunity to rise up and share their own future. Let us pray that by International Women's Day 2027, Iranian mothers, daughters, grandmothers will stand here themselves, speaking for a new reality in Iran, where women finally have what they have been denied for too long: rights and justice. I want to thank the esteemed guest that we have today.
Israel's representative at the UN. He's speaking in New York. You could hear him there really restating what we already know the Israeli position is that whoever the Iranian leader is at the moment, and we know Mojtaba Khamenei has been named in the last 24 hours. They said the change of leader is not a change of regime. We already know that the new supreme leader is a target both for Israel and for the US. And also, interestingly, again, calling on people inside Iran to rise up and try and topple the regime. But as we know, that is an enormously difficult thing for them to do. You remember the protests back in January where tens of thousands of Iranian protesters were killed by the regime when they decided to demonstrate on the street. So it is a rhetoric that we keep hearing from Israel and the US, but the difference between what they're saying and the action that they're calling for is really very different. So we'll continue to keep an eye on what is happening at the UN. In the meantime, President Zelensky has said that Ukrainian drone experts will arrive in the Middle East this week to help protect Gulf states like this one where I am in Qatar, who are under attack from Iran. Ukraine has spent 4 years, of course, inventing cheap but very effective ways of defending their skies from similar Russian strikes. Let's get more on this with our diplomatic correspondent James Landale, who's in Kyiv and has been seeing the technology in action. James, it is a useful amount of information, isn't it, that the Ukrainians actually have to give here at the moment?
Oh, it's clearly incredibly valuable, not least because President Zelensky now says that no fewer than 11 countries have now asked for help in the Middle East, in Europe, and of course the United States. I have to say there's some surprise here in Ukraine that the rest of the world has taken so long to wake up to the value of this technology. In other words, cheap ways of bringing down cheap drones that have been so deadly here in Ukraine for 4 years. And the Middle East has, in the last few weeks, realized equally how damaging they can be. We've been to see some of these drones being made and being tested. And they're very simple things. They're relatively small. They're relatively cheap. They're small quadcopters that can go really fast with a little charge on the end. They cost something north of $1,000. And they fly up into the sky, and the pilot with his screen here just literally flies it straight up onto the drone and destroys it. What we've seen, as you've seen in the Middle East in recent weeks and days, is incredibly expensive missiles being used for that job. Missiles that cost, millions of dollars. And I think the Gulf and other countries are now knocking on Ukraine's door to say, right, what can we get in terms of kit, in terms of experience? Because the key thing to understand here is it's not just about handing over drones. There's a huge amount of experience and training that's required as well. There's also complicated. You've got to fit these things into your air defense systems. That means you've got to train a lot of people within your military. So it's not something that can happen overnight. And the key calculations for the Ukrainians is this. They want to help, but they don't want to weaken their own defenses by giving too many of these drones away. So they are saying to all of these 11 countries asking for help, okay, you can have some help, but in return, we want some of your Patriot missiles and other of the really expensive air defenses that Ukraine needs to bring down Russian missiles, because at that point, you need a big missile to destroy a missile. And so that's the calculation that they're trying to grapple with here in Kyiv.
James, thank you. That is James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent there in Kyiv. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. I'm Anna Foster here in the Qatari capital, Doha. Now, the selection of Mujtaba Khamenei as Iran's new supreme leader has been welcomed by Russia's President Vladimir Putin. We've also just heard a very different opinion from the US. The New York Post quoting that Donald Trump says he is not happy, in his words, after the son of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been named as the new supreme leader in Iran. Let's speak to Megan Sutcliffe, who's Middle East and Africa analyst for Sibylline, a strategic risk advisory group. Megan, thank you for joining us. Really what President Trump is doing there is is restating his position. He said that he wanted to have involvement in the selection of Iran's new supreme leader. Of course, he wasn't given that. The decision was made according to the usual structure, if you like, by the Assembly of Experts. What does this mean in terms of what the US is likely to do next?
Good afternoon, Anna. Thank you for having me on the program. It's certainly not a good start to the next potential era of US-Iranian relations. US President Donald Trump has repeatedly referred to Mojtaba Khamenei as a, quote, lightweight. He is highly unlikely to accept his appointment as a supreme leader. So what we can expect over the next few days is an increasingly concerted effort by the United States and by Israel to remove Mojtaba Khamenei from his position, likely through kinetic means.
And when you say kinetic means, Megan, just set out for us what exactly you mean by that.
Well, that likely means an assassination attempt, whether that was through airstrikes or whether through some form of very limited special forces operation within Iran. This, of course, would be very detrimental to the stability of the Islamic Republic. We have already experienced an 8-day leadership vacuum between the death of Mojtaba Khamenei's father, Ali Khamenei, and his appointment. The longer that type of leadership vacuum exists within a highly centralized system such as Iran, the greater the risk of a devolution into a decentralized conflict will be, with terrible implications for regional security.
Megan, thank you for joining us. Megan Sutcliffe there. Well, let's look at some of the targets that are being struck, because over the weekend, an Iranian desalination plant was bombed by the US and Israel, which was then followed by Iran attacking a similar plant in Bahrain. And that marks an escalation in the conflict, a change of direction, really, because destroying a plant which makes clean water clearly has a significant impact on the civilian population in desert countries like this one, while also having little effect on the mechanisms that are used to fight. So it raises some quite serious questions if that becomes the status quo. I'm joined by Dr. Mark Owen-Jones, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, with me here in Doha. Thank you for being with us. That is in no way something which, as we were saying, contributes to the war effort. That is very much on both sides a direct attack on civilians.
Yeah, I mean, it's against international law, but I think you have the reason Iran are doing it, for example, is to essentially create a situation, especially in the Gulf states, where the Gulf states are more likely to pressure their allies, the US, to de-escalate the war. Let's not forget, this is more serious for the Gulf states than it is for Iran. Some Gulf states, 90% of their drinking water comes from desalination, for example, in Kuwait. So it's a really serious issue for these Gulf states. So it is part of Iran's war strategy. It's an asymmetrical war. They don't have the means to compete militarily with the US. So that explains partially why they're resorting to these tactics. Also, it could be explained by the fact the US apparently or reportedly attacked Kashmir Island's water supply. So maybe they're doing it purely as a response. But that response is really showing the significant and grave effects that will have. And the Gulf states will be incredibly nervous and anxious and arguably pressuring the US to really de-escalate this conflict.
When we look at, as you were saying there, things like access to clean water, we've already talked about vital industries for these Gulf states that have an impact around the world, things like the supply of oil, of liquefied natural gas. Do we know that pressure is now going on behind the scenes? Do we have any sort of indication about what the Gulf states might be saying to the US?
Yeah, well, it's not clear what they're saying, but I think, for example, we saw recently that the Iranians apologized to the Gulf states for those attacks. This was arguably seen as a form of diplomacy, trying to basically allow the US back at the table to say that it would be good faith negotiations, but Donald Trump scuppered that. So it does seem that there has been success. I don't think the Iranian apology would have come without some lobbying on behalf of the Gulf states, but right now it does not necessarily seem that the US in particular are responsive to the desire of the allies. I think this has been very evident in the US's approach to not just the Gulf, but to Ukraine and to Greenland. And so I don't know how the Gulf states feel in terms of their ability to influence the US administration, which, as we know, has been very transactional. But I do think that the US has been surprised, and Trump himself has said he's been surprised by the ferocity of the Iranian approach. And we also know that there's been about 7 different reasons given for this war. So I don't think the US have planned this long term, and I don't think they've factored in the impact on their Gulf allies. And this, as a result, is complicating how the negotiations will go.
And one of the areas of your research is around information, disinformation, such a huge part of this war in the way it's perceived really by people around the world and by governments around the world as well, ultimately, who are getting some of their information from the same places.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting things about these attacks on civilian infrastructure, they will also form a part of this narrative warfare. We've seen a load of AI-generated images, for example, of attacks on US bases in the region, but also civilian infrastructure, hotels. Why do that? Well, some people want to make money. But remember, in this asymmetric war, one of the reasons is to create a level of panic, to exaggerate perhaps the military successes, in particular of Iran, and by doing so, try to create that pressure, especially amongst Gulf allies, to pressure the US by saying this war is really bad, look at what it's doing, even if this is AI. And that will then, in theory, put pressure on the US to de-escalate the situation. So it does serve a strategic purpose. It also serves as a form of propaganda to say, look how well our side is doing.
Mark, thanks ever so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Dr. Mark Owen-Jones with me here in Doha. Worth also reminding you that meeting, that key meeting of G7 finance ministers that was happening a little earlier, who are going to try and work out what to do, particularly about the oil crisis, which is looming, the gas crisis, energy that is produced in places like this, Qatar and around the Gulf, not able to get out and around the world at the moment as the key shipping lane, the Strait of Hormuz, remains closed. Now, that meeting, we know that the markets responded well to the fact that that meeting was happening, but we also know that it broke up without any agreement on what to do. So that's something that we will continue to focus on. Of course, the economic impact, which is now spreading around the world as well, of course, as the war itself in Iran. So much more to come. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
For the first time during the Iran conflict, B-52s have landed in the UK. US Air Force planes could carry out strikes against Iran after Sir Keir Starmer granted permission to use the base. Let's take you to Duncan Kennedy, who is there for us at RAF Efford. A lot of activity there today. Duncan, despite the weather, what's been happening?
A lot of activity, Lucy, especially over the last 72 hours or so. Some of the real heavy-duty American firepower, if you can put it like that. So in this morning, we've seen 3 B-52s land, for example. They've come in from somewhere. We don't know where they've come in from. These are the old Warhorse aircraft that date back to the mid-1950s. Seen service everywhere from Vietnam to Afghanistan. They're subsonic, they're not particularly fast, but they can travel vast distances and deliver a huge payload of munitions. They've come to Fairford because it's got a gigantic runway, something like 10,000 feet long. We've also seen over the weekend 4 B-1 bombers land. These are much more modern aircraft. They're slightly stealthy. They too can travel thousands of miles without the need for being refueled. And they can also carry huge payloads of weapons, most notably for the B-1s, up to 24 cruise missiles. We don't know what all these movements mean, Lucy, but lots of it, and a demonstration of the size of the American firepower that they can bring to bear when these kinds of conflicts arise.
And the politics of this, Duncan, the fact that they're only there because the Prime Minister gave permission for them to land.
That's right. like you remember this row between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer about access to bases like this and to the one in the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia. Last Sunday, not yesterday, last Sunday, the British Prime Minister said, yes, the Americans can use these UK bases, only, though, for defensive missions. And what that probably means is, if these take off, they'll go to Iran, not to attack it generally, but to take out things like ballistic missile bases or drone launchers, so that those missile bases and those drones can't be used to attack UK and other allied bases in the region. So that's what it most likely means, that they'll be in a defensive posture. What we don't know, though, Lucy, is that a week, 2, 3, 4 weeks down the line, could the Americans come back and say to Mr. Starmer, look, you know, we need to up this game, we need to go on offensive missions and change the use of these bases. If they did that, there will be an almighty row between the UK and the US over that forced posture.
Now it is time for BBC Your Voice. Welcome to BBC Your Voice. It is day 10 of the Iran war, and we're going to spend the next half an hour answering your questions about the energy, oil prices, the multiple economic impacts this war is having, impacts that are only spiralling. Well, with me here in the studio is our Deputy Economics Editor, Darshini David. Barbara Plett-Usher is in Doha for us, and Bill Van Price also joins us. He leads the gas programme at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. So let's get cracking. To Darshini first of all, and the first question, Darshini, it is being asked, how much of the world's oil actually comes from Iran?
And that is a very good question indeed. It is one of the top 5 producers in the world, one of the biggest, with proven reserves as well. But remember, a lot of the West wasn't buying its oil from Iran. So why have we seen such a big price shock on the markets? Much of that oil was going to the likes of China. And what we're talking about here really is the disruption to the region as a whole. So that Strait of Hormuz, that waterway we've heard so much about over the last week, the fact that traffic is practically at a standstill there means that not much is flowing east, and that is causing problems across the region. If you look at Saudi as well, for example, it has said that it's cutting back on production, which is a bit of a blow to the global market because it can't get the oil away fast enough. So that is the problem at the moment. So really, it's not so much a question of where the oil, how much the oil comes from Iran, but frankly, what the wider disruption has been.
Bill, let me bring you in because an opening question to you. We're 10 days into this. Where are we when it comes to the price of crude oil?
Well, we've seen crude bounce much higher since the start of this conflict. This morning, though, it was up a big leg, up as high as $118 for Brent futures. It's come down a fair bit since then, probably on the stories around a potential release of strategic stocks by the International Energy Agency. But prices are still very, very elevated. And that's not just oil, it's oil products as well, refined products, and also gas, because a lot of the world's LNG comes from the Gulf.
Barbara, we're seeing the graphic in terms of the price spike there on the screen. Just in the last 48 hours even, tell us a little more about the areas, the oil facilities that have been struck.
So Bahrain today, there was an attack on the largest oil refinery in Bahrain. A fire started. That's been brought under control, but the energy company in Bahrain has announced a force majeure, which means it believes it cannot meet its contractual obligations. You've also had in the past 48 hours several waves of drones targeting the largest oil field, or a very large oil field in Saudi Arabia. These have been intercepted. You also had a strike that set alight fuel tankers at Kuwait's international airport. Now, after that, the fuel storage, at the airport. After that, Kuwait's energy company announced that it was going to begin to cut back production, also announced force majeure. And on Saturday morning, there was an oil tanker hit in the Gulf. This is what the Iranians said. Of course, you had a number of attacks last week as well in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, and some terminals in the United Arab Emirates where fires started from falling debris.
Darshini, in terms of the consequences, all of that, it is already being passed on at the pump. So take me through the changes we've seen.
Well, indeed, Matthew, this is interesting because when the start of this all happened, beginning of last week, we were all saying this will take days, weeks to feed through to consumers if this is sustained. What we've seen since then is obviously the oil price going further up, and retailers, and this seems to be a pretty much universal thing, being pretty quick to pass these on. So here in the UK, for example, a big motoring organisation, the RAC, is talking about petrol per litre passing 150p rather, per litre, perhaps in the near future. Diesel going over 160 pence, perhaps even higher. A lot of this depends on how fast and how much further we see oil prices going. But this has been a common theme elsewhere as well. In Australia, for example, they've talked about the number of cents going on to a price there and saying, hang on, is this really justified? In the US as well. And let's not forget that in America, gasoline prices, unlike anywhere else, they are the biggest shaper of your thoughts about inflation, right? So this is a hugely politically contentious area. Prices there passing $3 per gallon at the pumps on average.
Yes, that's interesting. Without diving in, it's not that long ago at the State of the Union, Donald Trump was boasting about how low the prices were. I mean, he used a figure that didn't check out in terms of fact-checking, but a big jump from the reality even on the ground when he was talking back then. And that's only a few weeks ago.
That is only a few weeks ago. And when I say over $3 per gallon, I mean, some people watching and think, blimey, that's actually quite cheap compared to my own market. But so let's not forget, it varies hugely across the US even. And this is something that is going to become a feature of coming days. Now, when you talk to all these organisations and you talk to governments and you say, what should be happening? Is this all justified? And, you know, there's reports coming in, by the way, and this is, again, something that's happening around the world, of people on petrol forecourt staff being, you know, abused by customers who say, is this really justified? Are you profiteering? Etc., etc. And in some markets, including the UK, there has been concern about the size of profit margins. On the other hand, you can see these costs, can't you? And the uncertainty going up and up by the day.
Bill, let me bring you back in because Barbara touched upon it, but just take us through in a bit more detail about how much of the world's oil actually comes through the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, there's easy numbers for that, for both LNG and oil. It's about 20% of global supply, which is about 21 million barrels a day of oil, and also a big chunk of LNG, as I said, about 20% of global supply. Now, there isn't really any way to get around the Strait of Hormuz. There are some pipelines that cut it out, but they they're not sufficiently large enough to mitigate that total number. So that's why prices have gone so high. It's the takeaway after the weekend that Iran's not changing its stance, and that the US seems not interested in any sort of off-ramp to this conflict. And I think that's why oil prices have driven so high so quickly.
Barbara, in terms of questions coming into us, Henry asks one that says, why are the containers not crossing through the strait? I think we know, but tell us more detail about the threats, and also adds, who has control of that area?
Well, so the strait is not officially closed, but the Iranians essentially control it, especially because they have been attacking ships that go through. They've attacked a number of them and warned ships not to go through. So most of them aren't. 3 of them have, 1 Saudi, 2 Iranians, but most are not going to take the chance. Although a UK maritime monitor says it looks as if the Iranians are just as much about creating disruption and uncertainty. They're not exclusively trying to sink ships. They're trying to disrupt the trade. The other issue, Matthew, is insurance, because although the ships don't want to risk going through themselves, they can't afford to pay for it because insurers are not going to pay those costs. Now, the United States has said it's going to backstop some of that. It's going to guarantee or provide up to $20 billion of insurance for vessels that want to cross, but that will probably take some time. It has also said it might
provide a naval escort, but not right now because it's actually fighting a war right now. So I think the strait is going to be in crisis until the fighting stops or dies down significantly. You've got the closure of this passageway. You've also got production being cut or downsized in the Gulf, and those are the two. It's a perfect storm, really, to have the two of them together.
It is, and most analysts, in terms of those options that Donald Trump has floated, the idea of underwriting insurance and also escorting traffic through there, both are being considered as hugely unlikely and impractical. Darshini, let me turn to a separate issue in terms of some of the impacts in Asia, especially. Take me through that.
Well, it's been fascinating, hasn't it? If you watch the stock markets as they reopened for the week, we saw that slump in markets as that reality that Bill was talking about hit, that there was no going to be quick solution to all of this. And Asia matters in this particular conversation because you look at that map and you think, where is not just the oil, but the liquid natural gas going to that normally flows through that waterway? A lot of it is destined for Asia, right? So South Korea, for example, real concerns about whether or not, big manufacturing nation, can they get enough of that stuff? And that in turn is bidding up the price of oil and gas from the rest of the world. And that's why stock markets there have been suffering particularly badly, and indeed markets around the world. This is a global problem, isn't it? When we talk about the global cost of oil and gas, inflation fears have been stoked, and as a result, what you're seeing is borrowing costs going up, bond markets reacting in kind. So that has all sorts of repercussions, not just for governments around the world, because that impacts their borrowing costs, but also for mortgage rates, for people taking out new mortgage deals. So what's happening, in one little corner of the world has this real global impact on consumers up and down in different countries.
Bill, you touched upon the impact on countries and where they get their oil and gas from. Pick up with that thought, because a question here, could countries actually run out of gas and oil? What is the answer to that question?
I think the answer to that question is they could certainly stop being able to afford to buy oil and gas. And that comes to the same thing ultimately. I think that the problem is that when you get a market supply shock like this, prices rise so that they can ration demand. And that's what we're going to see. We saw in the crisis in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine and Russian gas supply to Europe started being cut. We saw some countries, particularly South Asian countries, could no longer afford LNG because of the rise in prices. And you'll see something similar happen in oil and gas as well this time around.
Darshini, a question here from Colin, who says, we have an abundance of oil and gas in the North Sea. So is there any sign of any sort of rethink from the UK government on that in terms of policy?
Well, you're right, Colin. We do have a lot of oil and gas, but the truth is that since, I think it's about the mid-noughties, we've been net importers of oil and gas because we use more than we're actually able to produce. Also, there's different types of grades, right? And some of the forms, like, for example, jet fuel, we have to import because we don't actually produce and refine the right kind of stuff ourselves. So it's a bit of give and take. And if you start cancelling, outgoing contracts, then imagine what the repercussions could be like. So there is a case for saying, well, this is something that perhaps when the government thinks about our future energy policy, we should be thinking about that and how we actually deal with it. Also being self-sufficient in energy, that's a bigger question. But right now, when we talk about our position in oil and gas, yes, we produce a lot of it goes elsewhere, we get a lot in from overseas. But the good news at the moment, if you're in the UK, it doesn't look like we are facing by any means any kind of crunch in supplies.
Bill, a question that relates to what we saw only yesterday in Iran, especially in Tehran itself, because interrupting oil supplies is one thing, and that has an impact on price. We've discussed that, but targeting infrastructure of oil, that is something that is different and new. We saw